Today we will be exploring the topic working with Indigenous people. We will provide a brief history which shaped mental health in Indigenous people today and be explaining the Australian Psychological Society's current guidelines for working with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander clients. In continuing ACU's commitment to reconciliation and in line with the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander tradition, it is customary that we acknowledge the country as we pass through. Today we acknowledge and pay our respects to the First Peoples, traditional custodians of the land and waterways, the Turrbal and Jagera people, and we thank them for their continued hospitality. We acknowledge and celebrate the continuation of a living culture that has a unique role in this region. We also acknowledge elders past and present, as well as our emerging leaders of tomorrow, and thank them for their wisdom and guidance as we walk in their footsteps.
Before we get started on the topic of working with Indigenous people, there are a few points that need to be covered. Firstly, there is the Commonwealth working definition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. For an individual to be considered an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander person, they need to first identify as being Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, be of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander descent, and be accepted as such within their community. Contrary to what some people may believe, it is not the colour of an individual's skin that determines whether they are an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander person. Secondly, it is important to address the correct use of language. The following guidelines have been taken from the Queensland Health Protocols for Correct Terminology, with a full list able to be accessed from the Queensland Health website. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander is the preferred terminology, not Indigenous. However, this term is acceptable but must be capitalised. Given the ethical guidelines use Indigenous people as terminology, for the purpose of this speech, we will be using this. It is also correct to use Aboriginal person, not Aboriginal, and it should be Torres Strait Islander people, not Torres Strait Islanders. Another point to note is that an Indigenous person may refer to themselves by their language group. The following map presents an idea on language groups in Australia. However, it is important to know that this map is not intended to be a complete list, and boundaries are not fixed. The following slides contain considerations from empirical evidence around working with Indigenous people, including factors that have been shown to facilitate or hinder treatment and engagement with services. Relevant standards from the guidelines for working with Indigenous clients produced by the Australian Psychological Society have also been noted next to these considerations. However, the list of relevant guidelines is not exhaustive and serves as an example only as to how the guidelines fit within current research. If you are really keen, feel free to read the relevant articles with the authors listed at the bottom of the current slide. Do consider engaging with an Aboriginal health worker. An Aboriginal health worker is chosen from within the community, can help you to understand the community, and may be able to vouch for you. Be willing to work in consideration with others. Do consider individual factors of the Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander person, such as language group, gender, or family arrangement. Be aware of interpersonal characteristics and how these can affect treatment. Be aware of the community environment and do consider alternative treatment environments. Be aware of the impact of the historical treatment of Indigenous people. Be aware of the differences in conceptions of mental health. Be aware of the limitations of psychometric tests when applied to Indigenous people. And don't make assumptions around treatment, such as traditional methods used in the engagement of community. This point has been brought about by a more recent study that has highlighted that some Indigenous people may be seeking treatment from a white psychologist due to not wanting the community involved, though better outcomes are generally associated with the integration of traditional healing methods.
The history of Indigenous Australians is quite bleak, as they have innocently faced extreme historical persecution. Before European colonisation in 1788, Indigenous Australians had inhabited this land for over 45,000 years and formulated over 400 hunter-gatherer tribes with distinct social hierarchy and order. The arrival of Lieutenant James Cook in 1770 and the subsequent establishment of a penal colony in 1788 victimised the Indigenous community and caused significant hardship to their peoples. The immediate consequence of the invasion was the introduction of foreign epidemic diseases, including influenza, chickenpox and measles, to which the Indigenous community had no physiological protection. The second consequence of the invasion was the European assumption that the Indigenous population were nomadic, primitive and animalistic. The Europeans took advantage of their assumptions and stripped the Indigenous population of their land, food sources and water resources. Interracial sex and rape introduced sexually transmitted diseases to the Indigenous community, which created issues with birth rate and fertility. And the introduction of recreational drugs, including alcohol, tobacco and opium, began a downward spiral of substance abuse and addictive behaviours which are still present today. Due to the negative effects of European colonisation, between 1788 and 1900, the Indigenous community nearly became extinct, with a population decline of 90%, equating to roughly 50,000 to 90,000 deaths. Furthermore, in the early 20th century, anthropologists deemed the Indigenous culture inferior and unevolved compared to white Australian culture, to the extent where from 1910 to 1970, Indigenous children were forcibly removed from their families to assimilate to white culture and taught to reject their heritage. Although a national apology was made by Kevin Rudd in 2008 to the stolen generation, the trauma which Indigenous Australians have faced since the time of European arrival has had significant implications for their mental health. The Indigenous understanding of mental health is vastly different to Western ideals. Indigenous Australians conceptualise mental health as being holistic, where mental, physical, spiritual, emotional and social needs need to be in balance, with a focus on connectedness with one's family, community, environment and spiritual realm. There is a belief that the past and present, secular and sacred, material and spiritual, and natural and cultural are all harmoniously linked, where humans and nature are connected as one. A key difference between Western and Indigenous mental health is the causal attribution basis of ill health. Indigenous Australians believe that causes of mental illness are out of the individual's control and are typically explained by powerful forces, supernatural agents, in particular a negative relationship with the land or spirit world, where their spirit is wounded. A wounded spirit is the cause of symptoms such as depression, anxiety, and the feeling of alienation, and it is only the restoration of that spirit which will heal mental health problems. When affected by a wounded spirit, the Aboriginal community approach their elders. Elders have a natural healing ability from knowledge that has been passed down through family lines or from birth, and are responsible for pain management and protecting and restoring the spirits within their tribe. Through use of physical touch, song, and the ability to see and communicate with spirits, elders are able to enhance the mental health of their Indigenous clients. Overall, Indigenous people believe that mental health is contingent on balancing all individual needs and having a sense of connectedness with the world around them to ensure their spirit remains intact.
You'd actually ask people questions like, have you seen spirits? You know, have you actually seen things that no one else can see or hear? And Aboriginal people will say yes. And on the test you actually had to mark them down as having a potential psychosis. There are other things too in terms of our grief processes. When someone passes away, as part of our grieving we actually cut ourselves as an expression of grief. It's quite a common thing, we call them sorry cuts. And there was a mental status exam that actually asked the primary question, do you engage in deliberate acts of self-harm? And you can actually be sent into a psychiatric ward on the basis of answering yes to that question alone. Most Aboriginal people would answer yes to that.
Historically, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have experienced mistreatment by mainstream health and welfare services. Understandably, as a result, distrust of government and church officials carries over and creates resistance, fear and suspicion of contact with healthcare personnel. The Australian Indigenous Psychologists Association recommends that psychologists working with Indigenous clients are committed to recognising that Indigenous people have suffered the process of colonisation, which has created social, political and psychological disadvantage and has created diversity in their culture and identity. Historically, mental health problems have been used to disempower and disadvantage marginalised people. This may contribute to Indigenous people's avoidance of mental health services. Within Indigenous cultures, the concept of health is viewed holistically. Indigenous people consider mental health in a social, emotional context that encompasses oppression, racism, the environment, economic factors, stress, trauma, grief, cultural genocide, psychological processes, and ill health. With Indigenous communities, there are many groups, tribes, kinships, languages, and ways of living. The concept of family is more complex and wider than that of a Western constitution. Treatment of Indigenous people's mental health needs to be viewed in a more holistic way than that of a Western psychomedical paradigm. Indigenous people are less likely than non-Indigenous people to engage in mental health services. Westerman attributes this to the cultural inappropriateness of existing services and the failure of clinicians and services to embrace Indigenous conceptualisations of health and well-being.
Language marginalises people. It marginalises Aboriginal people because we don't have access to the flash clinical words. So you can be a really good cultural worker and you can actually know what's going on for your client, but when you go into a clinical world, because you can't speak that language, because you can't articulate it in a way that mainstream will pay attention to, you're quite often dismissed. The other thing is with, if you're a clinician or a non-Indigenous person, you're going into a cultural world, you're also marginalised too because you don't have access to our words and our language. You know what I mean?
Mental health interviews, as an example, are perceived as stressful and threatening if not conducted in a delicate, culturally appropriate way. Mental health assessments must match how Indigenous people are viewed within a cultural context of community rather than in comparison to a Western framework. A study by Vickery found that 92% of Indigenous people would not see a non-Indigenous practitioner unless another person in their community would vouch for them. Indigenous people are more likely to engage with a practitioner who is visible in their community, as it gives them the opportunity to judge the strength and the goodness of their spirit. Communication styles also differ, and the use of questions need to be open-ended and positively phrased, with more of a focus on a narrative style. Shame can be felt when people are spotlighted to provide a direct answer to a direct question. Westerman believes that practitioners demonstrate cultural inappropriateness when they engage the wrong level of cultural concentration for the presenting problem, engage a person of the opposite gender, engage a cultural consultant with an avoidant relationship with the client, engage someone from a different tribal or language group when they do not have an understanding of each other's cultures. Research by Westerman found failing to acknowledge and work within traditional methods of healing to be a primary barrier to people engaging in mental health services. When engaging with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander clients in mental health care, practitioners should offer the option of traditional methods of healing as a primary treatment, recognise and respect the traditional hierarchy of treatment for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander clients, facilitate traditional methods of healing through participation with traditional healers and cultural consultants at an appropriate level, and engage an Aboriginal health worker to facilitate cross-cultural communication and collaboration.
It's important that we take guidance from our Indigenous staff, that we take guidance from our community, and that we never presume that it's okay, because there are some very definite cultural boundaries that we need to be respectful of. In amongst that mix, also with our Indigenous staff seeing clients, sometimes there's respect required within family groups. Sometimes it might not be a gender issue. It may be a moiety issue, or if there may be somebody that, say, Helen can't see because they're a poison cousin, whereas Gloria might be able to see them.
To obtain the best outcomes in mental health services for Indigenous people, mental health issues must be guided by self-determination and culturally valid understandings. Practitioners need to treat clients with respect and equality and adapt service delivery to reflect the understanding of the diversity of the culture. Cultural competency is achieved through maintaining the capacity for cultural self-assessment while being aware of the dynamics inherent in cultural interactions.
The Australian Government's point of view regarding Indigenous mental health is strongly rooted within the holistic factors surrounding this diverse and culturally sensitive people. In the past, there were many problems regarding the effectiveness of ethnocentric mental health approaches, with little data being gathered on the subject. This has been the case all the way up until 1996, when Swan and Raphael implemented the first national consultation and analysis to report specifically on Indigenous mental health. They found that the previous policies regarding land taking, child removal, and a prominent lack of community resources had not only failed to fix the issues that the Indigenous communities were having, they actually perpetuated these issues, leading to more social and well-being problems. Following these findings, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Emotional and Social Wellbeing Action Plan was put in place in an attempt to create a united framework for coordinated and all-encompassing approaches to therapy and assistance. This marked the turning point in the government's point of view regarding mental health in Indigenous settings, and brought with it a broader acknowledgement regarding the cultural factors at play in these interactions, as well as the admission that the previous governmental point of view and actions in dealing with Indigenous peoples had been harmful. This new governmental framework included 9 main points proposed by Swan and Raphael, which were to shape not only policy making but the application of mental therapies. The 9 points are: 1. Health is holistic, encompassing mental, physical, cultural and spiritual health. 2. The right to self-determination. 3. The need for cultural understanding. 4. Recognition that the experiences of trauma and loss have intergenerational effects. 5. Recognition and respect of human rights. 6. Racism, stigma, environmental adversity and social disadvantage have negative impacts. 7. Recognition of the centrality of family and kinship and the bonds of reciprocal affection, responsibility and sharing. 8. Recognition of individual and community cultural diversity. And 9. Recognition of Indigenous strengths. These core principles have steered governmental action since their inception and have broadened the government's point of view regarding ethnocentric differences in how therapy should be applied. This new view on therapy and resource delivery is in agreement with the Australian Indigenous Psychology Society guidelines, which themselves not only build off these main principles, but also promote the notion of Indigenous psychologists being able to culturally insert themselves in the communities, and in line with these guidelines to be able to gain cultural understanding and respect for these communities, all in order to provide community-tailored therapy. In order to be able to bring holistic treatment that promotes these 9 core principles and delivers effective treatment to the best of their ability. The APS guidelines for working with Indigenous clients promotes respect for the dignity and rights of people and peoples in Section 2. This document also outlines and promotes culturally relevant informed consent in Section 3 and cultural competence in Section 4 in order to help Indigenous clients understand these different ways of thinking about illness that may not already be a part of their own cultural understandings of their issues. Competence is also a major factor for Indigenous health practitioners, as there is a possibility of harm, and such they must be aware of cultural and contextual factors regarding treatment in these environments, and also be aware of their own values and beliefs. These core values of the APS guidelines for Indigenous clients correlate with the new governmental viewpoint, as it aims to garner a more effective method of interaction by using previous knowledge and cultural awareness to garner a more understanding and differentiated approach. The Australian government until recently had not adopted a culturally sensitive method for dealing with Indigenous mental issues. Since 1996, however, massive steps have been taken in order to better understand these issues and to provide the best care possible. This point of view is shared by the Australian Indigenous Psychological Society and the Australian Psychology Society. and provides a shared platform aiming at providing the best service and care for the Indigenous population.
This brings us to the end of our presentation. We would like to leave you with the point that, although there are specific guidelines set by the Australian Psychological Society for working with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander clients, there is still a large amount of grey area in this field. If you're placed in a situation when you are working with an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander client, please be flexible and be aware that there could be potentially a lot of cultural background that you are unaware of. If you do not feel competent working with an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander client, we believe it is in the best interest of you and your client to either refer the case on or engage the use of external sources or other practitioners. James, Katie, Narissa, Sam and myself, Jane, would like to thank you for watching our presentation. We would also like to ask you to read and bring a copy of the APS guidelines for working with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander clients to our in-class learning activity in week 9.